Well, it's all gone quiet on Parliament Hill as the MPs have headed home for the holidays, but still lurking in the hallways, the fundraising issue. The Liberals seem to have decided to ride this one out, taking hits for weeks and not changing their position that all is good and they've done no wrong. Will that strategy work? Chantal is in Montreal, Andrew's here in Toronto, and Jennifer Ditchburn joins us this week from Ottawa. All right, every time we talk about this, we seem to have reached this kind of new kind of level in the fundraising story. Now we have the ethics commissioner wanting to talk to the Prime Minister. Have we reached a new level? Does this really raise the bar on this story, Andrew?
It's certainly, whenever you've got the ethics commissioner involved, it's never a good day for the government. It's been getting steadily worse, I guess I would say. It was one thing when it was just cabinet ministers and it was just $500. It was one thing when the Liberal Party could still say, you know, government business is never discussed at these meetings. We just, if anybody raises it, we tell them to go away. But we now learn that, in fact, the Prime Minister is involved, that these are these much more expensive $1,500 a pop things, that you have Chinese billionaires attending, that, in fact, government business is discussed. So you can no longer maintain the old storyline. And the Prime Minister's storyline now is this business of, well, they may have discussed it with me, but I didn't discuss it with them when they raised matters of, you know, can you make my bank application go through? I just said, let me tell you about our income tax plan for the middle class. It doesn't look terribly plausible. I think they were sort of saved by the bell, if you will, of the Christmas holiday, but I don't think it's going away.
I'm sure they are appreciating that bell, but it does make you wonder, Chantal, that they've taken hits. It's not just for a few days or a few weeks, it's been for quite some time. And yet they're standing by that sort of, we're fine, we haven't done anything wrong.
The charitable explanation would be that they have not been able to focus on this issue, that they don't really know what to do about it, and that they've tried to get to where we are today with the House risen to possibly get their heads around it. But what you've noticed over that period, and that is new for this government, is if you've watched question period as these attacks were hitting the Prime Minister and his House leader, the long faces on the Liberal benches. This is probably the first issue since Justin Trudeau opened Parliament where a caucus is uncomfortable and would like their government to do something to make this go away. And on that basis, I suspect, like Andrew, that it won't go away, and B, that their current strategy will not sustain them.
Jennifer, are you seeing it that way as well?
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole thing a bit mystifying. They used to delight when the ethics commissioner would go after the Conservatives, and in this case, the ethics commissioner is looking straight at the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, which is, I think, takes it to a whole different level. And it seems to sort of defy everything we know about crisis management and public relations, which is to kill the story, to do something and make it go away, which they could have done. And I think they still could do, but it's just really weird. I wonder if they have some sort of internal polling that tells them that Canadians aren't tuned into this or something, because it's been dragging on just for so long.
Well, to underline your point, watch how the Prime Minister handled questions on this today. Bob Fife, our friend from the Globe and Mail, who's been leading the way a lot on this story, went after the Prime Minister to try and understand his position on this, and here's one of their brief exchanges this morning.
We have very strict rules on fundraising at the federal level, and no one is suggesting that we are not following those rules, and that's something that's important for Canadians to remember.
Your own rules that you announced that said there should be not only no preferential treatment, there should be no perception of preferential treatment. How does that square with rich people meeting you at private mansions where they get to bend your ear for $1,500? I mean, how do those rules meet reality?
The fact is, at the federal level, our fundraising rules put very strict limits on personal donations.
And that's about as far as he got. What do we make of that, Chantal?
We make of that this exchange makes the Prime Minister look fairly bad. He is being quoted his own words, and that has been the problem with this entire story, is that he is in obvious contradiction with his own instructions to his ministers and the rules he said he would live by, not the law, but the rules. And when you hear this, And it was the same at this year-end news conference earlier in the week. There is no rationale to justify the position. Now, what I'm curious about is whether they're spooked by the Conservative capacity to fundraise, that they were spooked by it when they were in third place, and that they're figuring that any change will help the Conservatives and give the Conservatives a financial edge because they will be poorer. They will lose the edge of being in office. I can't think of any other reason to take this much pain for $1,500 to go to cocktails.
Well, it's serious pain when it's not just the promise on fundraising, it's kind of the implicit promise of the election, which was, we will do things differently. Yes. And on this, and not just this, on a few other things, it doesn't look like it's any different than it always was.
Yeah. And as this stuff accumulates, people say, well, it hasn't shown up in the polls yet, and that's probably true. But it doesn't mean it won't. And usually what happens is it starts to show up in questions about the Prime Minister's character. It might not show up even in the top line number about him, but it might show up in questions like, is he trustworthy? Does he care about people like me? Those kinds of character questions. Then eventually it shows up in the Prime Minister's numbers, and then when it really hits home is when it starts showing up in the party numbers. And I think even if, as I say, it doesn't show up in the headline polls today, I think Liberals have to be very concerned of damage being done below the waterline.
Jennifer?
Yeah, and it's funny, on this they should maybe take a page from the Conservatives, the early years of the Conservatives, because back then they also came to power the promise of doing business differently. And there were different ethical issues that came up. For example, remember when MPs went around giving government money using Conservative logos on their checks, or Bev Oda had a fundraiser that was immediately called down in 2006, 2007. So I think they acted very quickly to stamp out some of the early stories about ethical issues. But as Andrew says, over time, these things sort of tend to coagulate. So even if the public isn't tuned into this one, I don't know if the public is tuned into this one or not. If they're not, over time, though, these things, I think, coagulate. So for the Conservatives, whether it was transparency, government advertising, muzzling scientists, their relationship with the news media and information, for years it seemed like no one cared, and then all of a sudden they really cared, and they lost the election.
Well, as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, Christmas could not have come sooner for them on this one to put it aside for a while, unless there's some new development that doesn't need Parliament to deal with it on. The other question I wanted to ask you, we've seen this Parliament now in action for a year. From what we've witnessed, what has it told us about this Parliament? Leave the fundraising aside, this Parliament and the people in it. Chantal, you want to start?
It's probably tied to why the government, I think, wrongly decided to ride out the fundraising issue. This is an issue that came up in Parliament. My impression of the government over the past year is that Parliament is not all that important to them. The Prime Minister clearly is not a fan of being in question period. He's not a regular presence there. There is no real effort that you feel on their part to actually put up a more or less solid performance. They're really giving up that stage to the opposition parties. And most of the things that they accomplished, and they did accomplish things this year, were extra parliamentary things that mattered to them, climate deals, pipelines, etc. So an interesting Parliament, less acrimonious, but I think not as central to how the government believes it's crafting its image.
You're right. He does take a lot of time away from Parliament. And he also, hadn't there been a promise or an idea that they were going to try and do a daily, once a week question time just with the Prime Minister? I don't know what's happened to that, but it hasn't happened yet. Jennifer, how do you look back on the year in that way?
Well, I completely agree with Chantal. I think it's a very outward-facing government. But in terms of Parliament, and I guess maybe because it's the holiday season, I'll throw in something positive. But I actually saw glimmers of where MPs work together across party lines in some interesting ways. So before the Electoral Reform Committee went sideways, I think it was actually a really functional committee where people were listening, they were doing work together. If you talk to people who were in that committee, there seemed to be a lot of goodwill and civility. And then, well, we know what happened after. But also the physician-assisted dying committee that featured senators and MPs. There were all three major parties had people supporting the report that came out, and even the appointment process for Justice Malcolm Rowe, the latest appointment to the Supreme Court. I think there were areas I thought fairly interesting where MPs were able to work together. And one more thing was all-party support for helping Yazidi refugees, which was pushed by Michelle Rempel and Ronna Ambrose. So maybe some positive lights there.
Andrew.
Well, I admire Jennifer's ability to look on the bright side. I only wish I could be more like her. When I look at the last year, I see a lot of continuity. I mean, the previous government wasn't particularly known for its love of Parliament either, the previous Prime Minister. And there's a lot of continuity if you look at question period. It's as bad in many ways as it was before. I noticed that Nathan Cullen, the NDP critic, was shaking his head the other day saying, you know, the ghost of Paul Calandra, not the ghost of, but Paul Calandra is somewhere smiling ruefully at some of the answers that we were hearing from the government House leader this time. Her predecessor, Dominic LeBlanc, managed to get up everybody's noses on the opposition parties, was very high-handed in some of his tactics. You still have very leader-driven politics. We don't have leaders on the two main opposition parties, but Justin Trudeau bestrides his party more than probably any previous leader that I can think of in terms of the degree to which their popularity depends on him. So we're not really seeing the House of Commons acting as the kind of check on government that we would like it to see in a properly functioning parliamentary democracy. And of course, on the other hand, we're seeing the Senate, the unelected Senate, getting more and more obstreperous in ways that are not necessarily conducive to democratic government either. So I'm not so sure we're in great shape.
Are we, you know, it's like us as the media to go after often the issues, the problems that crop up. But when you look at this past year, and it's been interesting to listen to both Chantal and Jennifer talk about some of the accomplishments in terms of legislation. You know, in terms of a year, have there been more positives than negatives looking at it that way, accepting what Andrew said about some of the other issues that plague Parliament on a continuing basis? But Chantal? Your question was about Parliament. But Parliament is not all that politics is about and policy is about. And yes, this is a more proactive government, and it does try to engage in a variety of fields. We did have a discussion, a national discussion we're still having about pipelines, energy, the proper balance with climate change. The government is a player in that discussion. It's not sitting back saying we don't want to engage. There is a discussion ongoing about healthcare financing. You can go down the list, the medically assisted suicide legislation. That debate was an interesting debate that wasn't polarized by partisan consideration. So this isn't a government that's doing nothing. It is just a government that has very little time to manage or to care, it seems, about how it looks in Parliament. Okay, we've got 15 seconds left. Last word, Andrew.
It's an activist government, and it has been using some of the capital that is built up, and that's what you want to see governments doing, whether you agree necessarily with the policies or not. There's no use getting political capital if you don't spend it.